Every dog alive today is clinically anxious. Not some dogs. Not stressed dogs from bad homes. Every single one. And the cause isn't neglect or abuse or poor training. The cause is us. What we did to the wolf brain over 10,000 years is one of the most disturbing stories in the history of biology. And we are only now beginning to understand the full scale of the damage. In 1959, a Soviet geneticist named Dmitri Belyaev began selecting wild foxes for a single trait, which animals showed the least fear toward humans. He bred those together, then did it again. Within 6 generations, the foxes were wagging their tails. Within 20, they were seeking human contact, whimpering for attention, gazing at researchers with an intensity that took dogs thousands of years to develop. Belyaev had compressed an entire evolutionary arc into less than 2 decades. But something else arrived with the tameness that nobody had selected for. The foxes began showing compulsive behaviors, repetitive movements with no function, stress responses that activated without cause and never fully resolved, neurological instability that had no precedent in any wild population. The affection and the damage had not arrived together by coincidence. They were, at a genetic level, the same thing. And that discovery cracked open a question that the science has spent every decade since trying to answer. What exactly did we do to the wolf? A wild wolf brain runs on 400,000 years of uninterrupted calibration. It tracks individual relationships across an entire pack with a sophistication that rivals primates' social cognition. It reads emotional states from body language cues so fine that researchers need slow-motion footage to detect them. It holds a mental map of territory spanning hundreds of square miles, updates it continuously, and plans movements across terrain it won't reach for days. Its stress response activates during threat and returns to baseline once the threat passes. Its social attachments are stable, consistent, and governed by a hierarchy its nervous system was built to navigate. Everything about the wild wolf brain makes sense inside the world the wild wolf brain was built for. Then some wolves began staying near human settlements, tolerating proximity, scavenging the edges of a world they had not evolved alongside. The ones that tolerated it best reproduced. Their offspring tolerated it more, and what began as behavioral flexibility slowly became something the wolf could not undo. Because humans did not just accept the wolves that approached. They selected them, bred them, chose generation after generation, which animals lived and which did not. And the criterion was always the same. How oriented is this animal toward us? That selection pressure, sustained across thousands of years, did something to the wolf brain that no predator in the history of vertebrate life had ever experienced before. It redirected the primary social architecture, the neural systems wild wolves use to track pack members, to read the emotional landscape of their own species, to organize their world around relationships that made biological sense, were gradually, irreversibly reoriented toward humans, away from themselves, away from everything their neurology was actually built to process. What that produced was an animal whose nervous system now organizes itself entirely around the presence of a species it shares almost no evolutionary history with. And what happens when that species is absent is not what anyone who has watched a happy dog would expect. Studies measuring the stress responses of dogs left alone for even short periods show cortisol spikes that are, in clinical terms, indistinguishable from acute separation anxiety in human patients. The neurological activation patterns are not similar. They are identical. And this is not a response to unusual or threatening conditions. This is what happens in a normal house, on a normal day, when a person leaves for work. The brain that was rebuilt around human presence has no regulatory mechanism that functions without it. Remove the anchor and the system goes into crisis. Every time, without exception. But the chronic anxiety runs deeper than separation. When researchers compared baseline cortisol levels in domesticated wolves and dogs against wild wolf populations, they expected domesticated animals to show lower stress hormones, safer lives, more reliable food, reduced predation pressure. The result was the opposite. Domesticated wolves carry chronically elevated cortisol even in conditions of complete safety. They're stress response systems, the ancient machinery designed to switch on during threat and switch off once the threat resolves. Never fully switch off. There is no trigger. There's no threat. The elevated state simply runs permanently underneath everything else, like a system that has forgotten how to return to baseline because baseline no longer exists. In human psychiatry, this is called generalized anxiety disorder, a nervous system so dysregulated that it generates threat signals in the absence of any threat, because the architecture for distinguishing safe from unsafe has been compromised at a structural level. Now go back to Belyaev's foxes, because buried inside his results was a biological mechanism that explains exactly how this happens and why it cannot be separated from the domestication process itself. As his foxes became tamer across generations, they began changing physically in ways he had not selected for and did not predict. Floppy ears, piebald coats, shortened snouts, curled tails, juvenile skull proportions retained into adulthood. These were not incidental. They were the signatures of something happening at the deepest level of embryonic development, a cell population called neural crest cells. During fetal development, neural crest cells migrate through the embryo and build an extraordinary range of structures. The adrenal glands, the pigmentation system, parts of the jaw and skull, the cartilage of the ears, and critically, the stress response architecture of the developing brain. When you select for reduced fear of humans, you are selecting for suppressed adrenal reactivity. When you suppress adrenal reactivity through selective breeding, the neural crest cells that build the adrenal system are also the cells that build the ears, the coat pigmentation, the snout. You get floppy ears and piebald coloring as an unavoidable biological side effect because the same developmental machinery builds all of it. Tameness and neurological fragility are not linked traits. They are one trait expressed across different systems simultaneously. There's no version of domestication that produces the first without the second. It is not possible. And then there is the question of what that neurologically fragile, human-oriented brain was walking into. Wild wolf social structure, however brutal on its own terms, is stable. Dominance is established through ritualized behavior and maintained through consistency. Relationships persist. The hierarchy is legible. The social world the wolf brain evolved to navigate is, above everything else, predictable. Its instincts align with its environment. Its responses make sense inside the world producing them. The human world is none of those things, and the wolves that entered it brought nervous systems exquisitely calibrated for predictability into an environment governed by emotional volatility, arbitrary rules, and social logic that no wolf brain had any evolutionary framework to decode. The attentiveness that made domesticated wolves so responsive to human faces and moods also made them uniquely vulnerable to human inconsistency. Every signal misread, every unpredictable response, every moment of volatility landing on a nervous system that was already running without a reliable baseline. The behavioral result is documented extensively across domesticated wolf and dog populations worldwide. Compulsive repetitive behaviors, hypervigilance that does not resolve in objectively safe environments, exaggerated fear responses to stimuli that carry no actual threat, inability to return to calm once emotionally activated, shadow behaviors, where animals follow humans compulsively from room to room not out of affection, but because the nervous system cannot self-regulate without proximity to its anchor. Every single one of these is a recognized clinical presentation in human psychiatry, not loosely analogous, clinically identical. A psychiatrist shown the neurological data without context would identify the disorders before being told what species produced them. Wild wolves show none of this. Their brains are running the architecture they were built to run, inside the world that architecture was built for. The wolves that chose us lost that. Generation by generation, selection by selection, the original brain was replaced by something oriented entirely around a species that did not understand what it was doing to the animal in front of it. We did not domesticate the wolf. We disassembled it. We took a mind shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of pressure into something extraordinary, and we rebuilt it around ourselves. And the mind we built looks, in every clinical measure available, Like a mind in permanent crisis, the wolf walked toward us. We changed it at the level of its cells, and it never had any way of knowing what it was giving up.